In the era of slavery in the United States, white plantation mistresses often saw strong, charismatic black slaves working in the fields. They couldn't help but feel deeply attracted to them. They wished that, if these slaves were white, they would probably marry them. However, because they were black, marrying them was considered taboo. Nonetheless, white plantation mistresses held power and could use these black slaves for their pleasure in any way they wanted. They exerted their power over hundreds of black slaves working in the cotton fields. Because the black slaves worked all day, their physical characteristics reached another level. Since there wasn't much charm left in the lives of white mistresses, they felt it would be lustful to use the slaves as tools for their satisfaction. However, no one knew what these white plantation mistresses truly did with their black slaves in secret rooms. So, how unpleasant and dirty were the sexual lives of the white plantation mistresses? Let's find out in this video. In Black history, little attention is paid to the deep despair of white plantation mistresses and how they coped with that by using strong black slaves. While their husbands exercised authority, the mistresses oversaw household affairs and managed the enslaved labor. This tempted them to use the black slaves as a tool to satisfy desires that had been previously repressed. Despite their social status, many mistresses experienced deep isolation and boredom. Their husbands, frequently absent due to plantation business or extramarital affairs, offered little in terms of companionship or emotional support. Even if this could be ignored, the white plantation mistresses were left unsatisfied when it came to their sexual lives. However, social norms confined the mistresses to domestic roles, worsening their loneliness and limiting their social interactions. Feeling neglected, some mistresses sought comfort elsewhere. Interactions between white women and enslaved individuals, particularly male slaves, were governed by racial hierarchies. Within the constraints of slavery, relationships between mistresses and black male slaves blurred social and racial lines. Although prohibited by social norms and laws, historical evidence suggests that these connections existed, albeit in clandestine and often coercive circumstances. The physical labor performed by enslaved individuals brought them into regular contact with the mistresses, creating opportunities for interaction. However, the inherent power dynamics in the master-slave relationship sometimes led to exploitation and manipulation. For certain mistresses, illicit relationships with black male slaves offered intimacy. Mistresses would first use subtle signals and gestures to convey their interest or attraction to a particular slave. These signals could include prolonged looks, discreet touches, or conversations with suggestive tones. However, because they were slaves, white plantation mistresses didn't need their consent. They could force them to do whatever they wanted. In some cases, mistresses abused their authority to assign tasks to favored slaves that allowed closer interaction, thus creating opportunities for greater intimacy. Whether mutual attraction developed or not, black male slaves were called to secret areas and rooms, away from prying eyes. If the black male slaves did not visit the white mistresses, they knew they would be punished on trivial excuses. They would be accused, and as they couldn't prove their innocence, they would be severely punished. The greatest threat that forced black slaves to submit to the desires of white mistresses was the accusation of physically touching or behaving inappropriately with white women. This was an accusation that could lead to a slave being killed before they could prove their innocence. Therefore, black slaves could do nothing but comply with what was asked of them. Here's a reminder to support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving a like to the video. We want to build a strong community and need your support. Let's continue now. The nature of the sexual activities between the white mistress and the black male slave was shocking because white plantation mistresses did not want their husbands to know about their illicit activities. Isolated places were usually chosen to take the black slaves. Taking advantage of their authority and social status, the mistress could force the slave to fulfill her desires, regardless of the objections or reservations he might express. Usually, a white mistress didn't even want her friends to know about her dirty sexual life using her favorite black slaves. However, knowing that she would be alone with the slave made her feel insecure and vulnerable. Therefore, in most cases, several mistresses would join together, viewing the enslaved individual as a forbidden source of pleasure and entertainment. In these cases, multiple mistresses collectively pressured the slave to participate in sexual activities, asserting their dominance through their combined authority and numbers. These encounters were likely filled with tension and discomfort. The enslaved individual, outnumbered and physically restrained, would find himself in a vulnerable and powerless position. He would face dozens of white mistresses hungry for sexual pleasures who could do anything. They could assert their dominance over the slave, treating him as nothing more than a means to satisfy their own desires. In certain scenarios, the mistresses decided to physically restrain the slave by tying him to a bed or other furniture, further restricting his movement and reinforcing their control. These illicit activities unfolded in an atmosphere marked by secrecy, fear, and exploitation, with the enslaved individual enduring both the physical and emotional consequences of these encounters. However, the least known thing that white plantation mistresses would do to black male slaves was to ask them to imitate their white husbands. She knew that the slave was afraid of doing anything that could cause anger and lead to punishment. However, such fear became an obstacle to what the white mistress wanted next. She wanted the slave to be a dominant man and engage in sexual activities with her, and for that, she needed to make him feel the authority. Therefore, the white mistress would ask the slave to role-play. At first glance, this order may seem paradoxical, but it hinted at a deeper psychological complexity within the master-slave relationship. It suggests that the mistresses sought both dominance and security by engaging in taboo acts within a society governed by racial hierarchies and patriarchal norms. Within this power dynamic, the mistress's order for the slave to mimic her husband's behavior takes on additional significance. By making the slave adopt her husband's mannerisms, the mistress sought to find familiarity and comfort in a forbidden relationship. Additionally, this reflected the mistress's desire for dominance and control in the sexual dynamic. She wanted to feel what she couldn't while married to her husband. She wanted to be completely satisfied, but in the name of her husband. Perhaps this was a way to convince herself that engaging in sexual relations was not unethical. By instructing the slave to assume the role of her husband, she subverted the traditional power structure, positioning herself as the dominant partner. But at the same time, she could be submissive, allowing the male slave to indulge her with force. This was something the white mistress could never obtain from her relationship with her husband. She couldn't get her husband to do what she ordered, which made black slaves a better option. That's when the white mistresses decided to make this sexual exploitation permanent. Instead of finding a new place for sexual encounters each time, they would build secret huts hidden in the cotton plantations. Now, no one was allowed to approach these huts except the white mistresses and their favorite slaves. During the day, while the male slaves worked on the plantations, the white mistresses would arrive and then head to the huts. This served as a signal for the male slaves to be ready and come to the hut. Once the slave was in the hut, the white mistress would lock the door and lie down, ordering the male slave to massage her, praise her, and be intimate. This would eventually lead to sexual encounters, after which the male slave would leave the hut and return to work. The white mistress would dress and leave as if nothing had happened. From that moment on, she would await the next encounter. While white plantation mistresses could hide their illicit relationships with black slaves, These interactions were dangerous for the slaves. If a slave was discovered to have a relationship with a white woman, the consequences were severe. They could be brutally punished or even executed without trial. Additionally, slaves were constantly monitored, making any interaction extremely risky. However, white mistresses could use their power to temporarily protect their favorites, ensuring they were not punished, at least while their relationships lasted. Over time, some mistresses developed an emotional attachment to their slaves, although these relationships were always marked by power inequality. In some cases, mistresses would even feel jealous if their favorite slaves seemed to show interest in other enslaved or free women. This dynamic added another layer of complexity and tension to an already complicated and dangerous relationship. Furthermore, Black male slaves, who were used by white mistresses for their pleasures, were viewed with disdain and envy by other slaves. This situation created an environment of resentment and distrust among the slaves themselves, weakening their sense of community and solidarity. For many slaves, being forced to fulfill the desires of white mistresses was an additional form of humiliation, on top of the countless cruelties they already suffered. Sexual abuse by white mistresses also had long-term consequences for the slaves who fathered children with them. The mixed-race children born of these relationships were generally not accepted by either white society or the enslaved community. These children were often sold, separating them from their mothers and condemning them to a life of slavery and marginalization. In conclusion, the sexual lives of white plantation mistresses with their black slaves were an extreme manifestation of power abuse and racial exploitation. These relationships were marked by coercion, secrecy, and inherently unequal power dynamics. Despite any emotional connection that might develop, slaves were always in a position of vulnerability and exploitation. This dark chapter of history serves as a reminder of the complexities and cruelties of the slavery system